So how does all of this apply to enterprise value integration? Well, one of the major premises of enterprise value integration is that we need to be able to measure value on different dimensions than what has traditionally been set up in the accounting system. And that process requires that we can't have our systems answer only predetermined questions, specific questions that have historically been important. The one question about the balance, and maybe according to LIFO and according to the US GAAP, according to shareholder value, that process of imposing those views upon the data when we capture the data means the data doesn't tell us about a whole bunch of other possible kinds of conditions. So if you were to think about, if you could potentially, theoretically, think about keeping that transactions for your business processes, and keep that at a detailed level. So let's go even further. If you looked at the general ledger within your organization, the general ledger accumulates every transaction that happens within the organization. Every financial transaction has to find its way into the general ledger in order for the general ledger to be accurate. So if you thought about the general ledger, and instead of the general ledger meaning 10,000 balances in summary that are predetermined by the accounting procedures, policies that were chosen up front, that were predetermined by the specific kinds of outcomes that one measured at the time the system was defined. Instead of having those 10,000 rows, if you imagined each one of those 10,000 rows became 10,000 rows of its own, so we have now a million rows in our Excel spreadsheet of all of the transactions that have occurred over time. It's theoretically, using Dr. McCarthy's approach, it's theoretically possible to add up all million rows and produce the 10,000 rows that are the accounting view. But I could also add up the million rows and produce a different view that will measure things in a different way. So let's think about how to do that. If I were to try to do this to start to establish a kind of system that allows me to measure these other kinds of things, I would think about establishing an environment that runs parallel to my financial system today. In the general ledger, I have those 10,000 rows, and I would want to establish a new Excel spreadsheet where I try to keep the 10,000 rows for the single business process represented by the first balance in the general ledger. If I can keep those 10,000 rows in a more detailed manner, then for that business process, I can begin to add together 10,000 rows, and it shows me other measurements of that business process than just the balance that's in the general ledger today. Once I do that, once I start working on the next business process, I could add another 10,000 rows to my new environment, and I could add together those in a different way, and I may end up with 20 balances instead of the 2 in the general ledger that give me much better view of customers or vendors or agents or processes or error rates. All of that sort of thing could come out of that detailed repository. It can't come out of the general ledger because those attributes were lost there. And starting with 20,000 rows, my environment's really, that's not very hard to do. As we begin this process of building this environment up, it's not too onerous for us to put together IT systems that can manage that sort of volume. When it gets to millions of rows, then it's a problem, but starting with the 10,000 is not really that hard to do. The important thing is to establish the data structures, to keep the detail and keep the attributes and have them consistent in some manner across the business processes involved. The more I go through that process of drilling down and keeping detail in there in time, if we do a good enough job of keeping all of the detail that's needed and generating new detail that's needed for things that go on in the financial system, because sometimes there are processes in the financial system like multi-currency processing if you're an international organization, reclassification processes, eliminations and consolidation, those all become additional rows in my detailed repository. And then I can start to build up to, in time, I could get this detailed repository, something that could produce my general ledger view and many other views. Now, at some point, that's going to become too voluminous and too expensive to do that all the time from the details. So where you're going to have to go is you're going to have to start to establish balances there at a more granular level. But that's not something you have to start with day one. That's something you can grow into over time. So the first step is going to be having to establish the Excel environment and the first 10,000 rows. That's going to be more expensive. Then when you get to the next business process and you add another 10,000 rows, adding 10,000 more rows to an existing environment is not difficult. It's not as expensive as establishing the environment up front. That process then will allow you to start to measure new things. It will allow you to measure things that reconcile with the general ledger so they have great credibility in the organization, because the data in the general ledger moves the market. It motivates behaviors today based upon the policies that have been decided. And so if you can prove that my repository has that sort of capability to produce those numbers, people think that that's accurate. They confidence in what's in there. But then you can also go further and do a cross-cut of the data, go across another dimension and say, hey, this data can also show us that if we think about EVI and the needs behind EVI, wow, see how if we changed our policies, we're starting to generate these kinds of values in that business process. That sort of step becomes much more powerful. That allows the organization to move towards better utilization of its resources, greater service to its customer, enhanced evaluation of employees across multiple dimensions. And all of that adds up to increased shareholder value as well, because we're not ignoring those kinds of details in our data. I think that concept's very powerful. It marries together the ideas of REA, makes them practical and possible with the ideas of enterprise value integration. That idea can be very useful to you in your business analytics work and can help you to outline where the organization could go long term, which would be a great benefit to the organization.